whether you got the most out of that assignment before you hit submit and complete it, right? So don't shortchange yourself there. Today's lesson is going to be the same, but keeping that in mind, that does give you a little bit extra time to finish up your project as well. So just, again, be mindful of that. We're trying to help you out here, and we know that you're learning a lot and hopefully you're coding along with us, right? So as we go over today's lesson, if anything's not tracking, please don't hesitate to bring that up so that we can make sure we get the most out of our time. Okay. So I know it's been like 5 months since we've been together last, but we are going to go back over React and we're going to talk about using React Router. Okay, so we did a little bit last week. Yeah, it was last week, getting into APIs, and now we are going to be adding navigation to our application. So we're going to be utilizing React Router, which will allow us to implement navigation between pages in a single page application. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, we should be able to implement React Router for single page application navigation, create and manage different routes within a React application, and develop a details page for specific items using React Router. Okay. Before we move on, I'm looking, Omar, great question. So is there a way we can do some exercises on React? So this really depends on what you're more comfortable with. So you're always welcome to code on your own computer using VS Code, similar options. If that's not what you're interested in doing at the moment, you can always utilize what's called stack blitz. So we can walk through this really quick. Not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but if you go to stack blitz, you can create a project. And it will let you, well, you sign up, right? So I'll log in through my GitHub here. Let's see, that one. So from here, you can create a new project and it'll actually give you different templates to choose from, right? So since you're working with React, I wouldn't suggest doing the TypeScript one here, right? So you could look here at front end. We could look for React and JavaScript. And when you create that, it will actually scaffold everything out for you for a basic React application, okay? So here we can see the application was created with Vite. The server is already up and running, right? This is your basic Vite scaffold. So this would be a good option for you if you wanted to code in the browser, but do highly recommend using VS Code for personal projects. And then as a reminder, when you're working on your projects, highly recommend using Codio. And the reason for that is, let's say you're working on your project, you get stuck, you reach out to Veronica, hey, I've got some questions, I'm not sure what to do. If you have it hosted somewhere else, she's not going to be able to view it easily, right? You have it in Codio, myself, Veronica, we can jump in and look at what's going on, right? So again, that's where the benefit of Codio is, among other things. But hopefully this helps, Omar, being able to do that. And if you have any questions about how to actually use React on VS Code or something like that, I mean, there's a handful of tutorials out there. Just would highly recommend Googling that. And if you aren't sure, we can help you proceed from there. Okay. So looks like Joseph is typing as well. I'm going to go ahead and let him finish, but we're going to move to the next page here. Excuse me while I realize my theme cleaner was going. Joseph, if you're done with the project in StackBlitz, you have an option to download or export. We can talk about that here at the end. If you could remind me, we can go over that. Okay. So let's go ahead and do some warm up here, just kind of get our brains moving. So what is the purpose of the keys prop views in React's map method? So it allows us to specify a unique key for each element. Child element specifies the position in the array we want to start mapping from, defines a CSS class to go to each element, or it specifies the number of iterations the map method should run. A, B, C, or D? We're getting a lot of A's in the chat. And that is correct. Oops. Here we go. Yep. So when we eventually we'll start getting into situations where we'll want to use that key specifically, and not passing something in with our first projects wasn't such a big deal, right? But now that we start getting things from the API and they have an ID, that's where adding that ID is going to be really beneficial. Okay. All right. What does the empty dependency array in the use effect hook represent? Is it A, B, C, or D? We got some B's in the chat. What do we got here? It is B. Yes. So it will run when the component mounts. So you can think of it like if you mount something, you put it on top, like it's being fixed. It's a couple different, I guess, I don't want to create issues with like a language barrier here, but just that's where some people say mount. I like to say render, right? So the first time the component is created, and then it's not going to run again, right? So if we add something in that dependency array, whether it's state or a prop, then anytime there's a mutation to either of those, then that use effect will run again. And just to be mindful, that's where you could always add some logic in there, right? So maybe you want some logic in a use effect to be run when the component initially renders. So you could have that logic, and then you could have logic to check to be like, hey, well, if the component's already rendered, then don't do it, right? I know some people might have multiple use effects, but the issue with that is, well, your multiple use effects, you could have it for different states and props, but they're always going to run when the component renders, right? So that's why it's easier to have a single use effect and just have logic to determine, well, hey, if it's already rendered, then don't run this part of the code, right? Only run it if there's something here. And we're not necessarily going to get into that, but that's just part of thinking through as a programmer, right? It's with the introduction of JavaScript, we're really starting to see how, we have to think logically, and we have to tell the compiler, we have to tell the computer what to do. Some people might think, oh man, it'd be nice if it could read our mind. I'm glad it can. Okay. So we are going to be making a project called Bob's Burgers Universe. So we are going to incorporate React Router, and we're going to start utilizing, I say start utilizing, we're going to incorporate this React Router with some of the stuff we've already been learning, right? About API calls and being able to map over that data, being able to render components, etc. So throughout this lesson, we're going to dive into the process of setting up routes, leveraging the link component, which will allow us to seamlessly navigate between pages. And then we're going to use this use params hook, which will actually allow us to generate dynamic character pages. Okay. So before we get started, any questions? Anything from last week? We're like, hey, it'd be good to have a refresher over this. Because again, we're not going to have a lab here. So it's really important that you are coding along as we're going through these different features. Okay, so any questions from last week that we can do a refresher on? And if not, that's totally fine. Just want to make sure this is your time here. I'll give it a second. I don't know about y'all, but it's cold here in Kansas City, so the heater's actually running, and it smells really bad because we haven't had the heater running in months. So it's working pretty hard at the moment. Okay, let's move on. So, Bob's Burgers Universe. So in this component, if we go to the app.jsx file, we're going to see that we have the basic app component, and we have a div with the class name of app. We have a header, and we have a home page. Okay. So let's go ahead. If we go to the terminal, click here, and as always, let's run npm run dev in the terminal. So it should run everything here. Don't worry about this warning, okay? It's just, again, it's a warning, yellow, warning, red, error, or severe vulnerability. And let's click this preview here to kind of see what we're working with, okay? So this is going to be our starter page. Okay. Not a whole lot going on here, but we're seeing that there's some characters here in our Bob's Burger universe. Okay. So let's look at the key files we're going to be working on today. And you can look at each of these components in more detail here. So we have our app.jsx, which we already talked about, and has a header and a home page. So we see header here, and then the home page is the bottom portion. Inside of the home page, we're going to see that we have an API call rather, in our use effect. So we're fetching some character data, we get our response, and we're rendering that response, right? So this is no different than what we've seen prior to last week, right? So we have our character data, we're mapping over it, we get our character parameter here, and then we have our ID, which we're using as a key, and we have an image, and then we have a name, and we're getting all of this from that response data up here, okay? Then we also have a Bob's profile right here. So this is dedicated to Bob, the titular character of Bob's Burgers. Then we also have a character profile component here. We haven't quite got into here yet, but you're going to see that it's a bunch of hard-coded stuff, okay? And then we also do have a not found component. So this is good where we'll see if you type something in that doesn't exist, we want to have a way to handle that, right? So we're looking here at the project. I would say it seems straightforward, but we've got some of the legwork done for us, right? So now it's a matter of how can we incorporate this router to be able to navigate to different pages, and then also use React Router to create some dynamic pages for us too, so we don't have to keep making multiple pages for this similar things, right? If we have a character profile, we can just create a template component and then pass that data in as props. All right. So we are going to be using the Bob's Burgers API to gather information about the show. So Bob's Burgers API, it's a RESTful API. If you remember from previous, we have like REST APIs, SOAP APIs, but I was telling you the REST are the ones that we're going to see the most, right? Inside of this API, it gives us data about the characters, episodes, etc. It is available for free. It doesn't require an API key, right? One of the reasons why we're using this. And when we get the data, it comes back in the JSON format. If you're interested about the Bob's Burgers API, you can actually click here. You can see what the response would look like. So for example, this endpoint here, if we do characters, someone throw a number between 1 and 30. Let's just any number. 19, perfect. That character is going to be Angel. I have no idea who this character is. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay. So he's a baseball player, voiced by David Herman. Okay. Who's that? Let's look that up. David Herman. Okay. So, point is, we have our documentation, right? So we know what to expect. If you were making this application from scratch, you could try this out. It gives you a generic response, and we would know how to render our content. Let's just do number 21 as well. Angie. Okay. Yeah. Oh, it's the essential oil saleswoman. I don't know if any of y'all remember her. We'll throw that up. That tracks. Okay. So again, we're going to be using the characters endpoint, which will allow us to pass in an ID, or we can just request however many characters we want, and then we'll get information from there. Okay. So we have 3 features that we're going to be implementing to be able to learn how to use React Router. So the first feature is we're going to implement or integrate React Router into the application. From there, we're going to use React Router's link component to navigate between the pages. And then we're going to use the useParams hook to take those IDs, and then we're going to generate individual character pages. So the reason why, and I want to stop here for a second, the reason why we see multiple features, the way it's broken down here, is this is going to be similar to how you would be working on an item or a task at your job, right? So you'd have typically what's called a user story. We'll learn about those more later, but it would break down. You'd have, I think I've mentioned this before, but it's a good reiteration, where you'd have a description of what is to be done. And then you'd have what's called acceptance criteria. So it would say, for your work to be done, you would need to do these things. And oftentimes, there would be an overall feature, maybe, and inside of there, you would have different user stories to complete that feature. So the reason I bring that up is when you are working in a day-to-day scenario, it's very often that you're going to have things broken down, and maybe the verbiage is different, but the point is, it's very rare to think of things in a just like, I'm going to be doing one thing and you don't break things up. It's very helpful, right, to look at something, being able to break it down into manageable pieces. So it's okay, I know I need to do this, I complete this. Okay, now I need to do the next thing and I complete that thing. Because we've talked about iterative testing, right? So there would be no point of us to start utilizing this link component if we hadn't integrated React Router first, right? So we're just trying to help condition you to think through, okay, I need to complete this first feature, and then I can go to the next feature, and then I can go to the next feature, because they all build on top of each other. And if you do any of these out of order, well, it can cause some problems, right? You might wonder why your application's not working. So the more often we're doing it like this, then eventually when you start working on projects, this is already going to be baked into your brain, right? You're already thinking this way if it's not already explicitly called out. So Joseph did have a comment in the chat. Yes, so there are going to be some APIs that are not free, right? So if any of you are familiar with Unsplash, for example, this API, it's not necessarily, it doesn't cost money to use, but you'd have to register as a developer, and then you'd have to get a custom API key, and you'd have to make sure to utilize that API key when you make a request. So they know who you are. They don't want just anyone being able to come in and just make requests to their server because that costs money. There's reasons for it, right? But there are definitely going to be some APIs that you would want to utilize that wouldn't be free. Google Maps, for example. So a Google Maps API, you could look at the pricing here. Searching there. So I think you get like $200. Yep, $200 each month. And then from there, it would cost money, right? So you would figure out, okay, well, how many requests am I going to make a month? It kind of ballparks what that would look like. So if you go to someone's website and you see that they have the Google Maps and you could do like navigation and stuff, they would have an account with Google and have a card on file, right? And hopefully on their end, they don't want to pay each month, but they'd have that card on file where if there are more requests per month than they're allotted for free, they would pay for that. But they still need an API key, right? You can't just go on and use the Google Maps API without having an account and a key. Okay, so let's look at this demo here. And again, this is for you to be doing as well, right? So this is a working version. So if we were to click on old Bob up here on the top, like let's say it's his account, right? We would see here, okay, well, this is just some basic information about Bob. We could go back and then let's go to old Jimmy Pesto, right? So we see here, full name, he's male, he was formerly voiced by Jay Johnston, and owner of Jimmy Pesto's Pizzeria, okay? Actually watched a deep dive into Jimmy Pesto here recently about how he's not actually Italian. It's interesting. But again, we'll see here. Let's actually open this up in a new browser because this is gonna we're gonna start understanding why we're doing what we're doing. So if you were to click on this profile here, Dalton Crespin, you're gonna see that it says Bob's Burgers universe.vercel.app/character/110. Okay. But then if I was to go back, let's click this little header icon here. I go to Gene Belcher, you'll see, okay, well, character 167. But the format looks the same, right? Every character you go to, everything's looking pretty similar. And it's because we're actually using a shared component to pass data in so that this reduces our, not just our workload, but the maintainability as well. Okay. So you can click around on this, kind of get a feel for how it works. But the main thing we're looking at here is each character has their own page. This Bob's Burgers, if you click on that, it'll take you back to the home page. And then if you click up here on old Bob, that takes you to his profile. Okay. All right. So React Router is a library provided by React to manage navigation and handling URLs for a React application. This allows us to create a single page application, remember, so it's a single component, but there's what we would consider a view or multiple views within this application. Okay, so it allows us to go from page to page while handling state, as we've been learning about, which allows us to have a very seamless user experience. You can read a little bit here about React Router, how it's created, but ultimately, this is something where if you're using React, you're going to be using React Router. There's, as far as I'm aware, no viable alternative. It's just kind of the de facto approach to take. So why would we want to use React Router? Well, as you see here, we're not seeing why not to, right? So this pretty, like I said, pretty definitive. Like if you're going to use navigation, you're going to use React Router. So when you have that SPA, that single page application experience, it allows you to go from page to page without a full page reload, right? So again, if you think back to your experience where maybe you're in dial-up, right? So let's think back to the day where we'd have Google. What I'm going to do here is go to network. I'm going to throttle this to 3G, right? And if I was to search Bob's Burgers and hit enter, we're seeing how long this takes to load, right? I mean, we're looking at for it to completely finish 10, I mean, it's still going at over 10 seconds, right? And while this may not seem like a big deal because it's Google, let's click on IMDb, right? And we see how long this takes. I'm not saying if you don't use React Router, things are going to take this long, but if you remember how things used to be where you'd have to go from page to page and it would refresh every single time that you'd go somewhere, that adds up to a very subpar user experience, right? So the React router allows you to go from page to page without that reload. It's just your data may change, a component may re-render. Client-side routing as well, again, that allows you to go from page to page, and you don't always have to make a new request to the server based on what's going on, right? This allows for faster navigation. The application is going to be more responsive because only what needs to be re-rendered will be re-rendered. You don't have to re-render everything each time you change the view. So for declarative routing, what this allows is you can have specific routes based on this JSX syntax. If you remember, like you could have like anchor tags and like these href attributes. So back in the day, everything would be like .html, .htm, right? We're not having to worry about that anymore. We can just have, bobsburgersuniverse.com/characters/112, right? And it's because there's not an actual HTML file. It's all that single page application with different views. And that's because we can use what's called dynamic route matching, where we can take a parameter or data and we can pass, like we can take it from the URL. And based on what that is, now we can start doing stuff with that to render dynamic content. And this is going to make a lot more sense once we actually start touching on this. But again, this React router is, and you're going to have similar things in Angular and Vue, but this concept of routing absolutely just changes the name of the game when it comes to development. I use Angular router in my day-to-day work, and I can't imagine having to handle navigation outside of what I can do in Angular. It's just, I remember what it was like to have a individual page for each data point, and you're having to navigate from page to page, and it would not work. nowadays. We've progressed past that. So when you want to use React Router, it is going to be a dependency you have to install. Okay, so if you remember, when we want to install new dependency, we need to be in the root level of your directory. So let's go back to that and think about that. When we say the root level of your directory, what does that mean? Like, where would we need to go when we're saying root? What does that mean? Looks like someone was typing for a second. We'll give it a few more seconds here. Don't like if you think you know, that's fine. Let's don't be afraid of guessing, and if you're wrong, that's totally fine. We're all learning here. So Omar's saying source, Joseph's saying base. Yeah, really looking for like base, right? Your main level of your folder. But a good thing to remember, and it's right here, right, is where your package.json file is located. Because when you run this npmi or npm install and you're installing that dependency, you want to make sure your package.json file is updated. If you try to run this in a different directory, well, it's now going to create a new package.json file, or it's going to say, well, hey, I can't find anything here. I don't know what to do, right? So we want to make sure we're in our root level. And we'll go back over that when we open up our file directory. Okay. So once we've installed React Router, there's main components that we're going to want to utilize. So again, we're installing a dependency. So now we can use React Router's components. So this first one is called a browser router. Okay. And what it's utilizing is an API, so HTML5, to keep the UI in sync with the URL that's in the browser bar, okay, the address bar. So in a similar way where we'd want to wrap our elements with like a div, right? So we think about like a sandwich. Browser router is the same way. So we would import browser router from React Router DOM, as we see here, but we also have to import React DOM as well. And here we would take our entire application, and this is in our index.jsx file. We take our entire application and wrap it inside of this browser router. So by wrapping this, what is that doing? So if we think through of how we've done other things, like we're talking about like props and all that, if we're wrapping this app inside of this browser router, what do we think this is doing? Again, if you're not sure, because we haven't really talked about this, right? Let's think through this critically. What do we think it might be doing here? So what's happening is the browser router, when we're wrapping it in the app, now the app is going to have the entire application is going to have access to what the browser router is providing. So here in the app component, we have our other nested components, right? We have Bob's profile, we have character profile. Now all of those components have access to this browser router, right? So it wouldn't really make sense to import this anywhere else, because if we want to route through our application, we're going to want to route through the entire thing. So this is the easiest way and established best practice is to take our application component and wrap it inside of this browser router. Then we also are going to have what's called a routes component. And we see this here in our app.jsx file. Because again, now we have access to the browser router and its shared components. So the routes is what's going to allow us to actually define the different routes we want to have. So now within this application, this is an example application, of course, we now have a path of just /, right? Which would just take you to the home page. We have a path of /blogs, which would take you to the component of blogs. And then /contact would take you to the contact component. And we're able to establish that by some props. We have a component prop within a route component. So we're saying, hey, when the path is /blogs, we want to send them to the blogs component. Okay. So this / route may seem trivial, but what do we think this means? If we see a / here, what route, like if we're looking at a website, what do we think just a basic / route might mean? You've probably seen this almost every single day and you're not even thinking about it. So root directory, yeah, I mean that's one way to think about it. So let's think about a website like Facebook, right? If I was just to do facebook.com / that would just take me to the main facebook.com, right? Whereas if I do facebook.com/messages, that ideally should take me to Facebook messages, right? That's a specific route we're looking at. But again, if I just go to facebook.com and do / it would take me to the home page. So this is just considered like your main route, right? So just whatever it is, / is kind of a catch-all. So we're saying, hey, this should go to the home page, but maybe that's not what we want, right? Maybe based on your web page, maybe the main page you want users to go to when they do omarsamazingwebsite.com / just your base, maybe you want to have them go to your blog first, right? And then based on that, they could go to, it could be an about page, a contact page, right? But you're establishing this is the main component or the main view you want your users to go to. Depends on the application. So again, we've kind of already talked about this, but the different attributes here, the path attribute is going to be the route, and then the component attribute or prop is going to be the component we want to render when the route matches the current URL. Okay, so that's where / blogs, the only way to get to the blogs view would be for it to be your domain / blogs. If you did blog, it wouldn't work. It's not a valid route. Okay. All right. Any questions about that before we move on to our first feature, wrapping our app in the browser router and going over these routes and route components? Any questions about any of this before we move to the next stage? You misrender this part here. Is that what you're talking about? So that's already part of our application. And that's already in our index.jsx file. What we're saying is, and this is from way back when we first started learning React, it's just kind of base code, right? So what it's saying is we are going to find an element by the ID of root, which is a div, and then we're going to take all of this and we're going to render it inside of there. So again, this is just kind of boilerplate code. So that's why we didn't really cover that. It's just the browser router is the thing that we are covering right now. But great question. So again, that's something where every React component is going to have something similar to this. It might be a little different syntax, but it's the same principle. Okay. But great question. So for feature one, we're going to have multiple steps, right? So again, we're thinking there's 3 features, multiple steps within each feature. So what we're going to do is we're going to incorporate React Router DOM to introduce routing to our application. So first, we're going to add browser router to our index.jsx file. Then we're going to add some routes and route components, and then we're going to start defining those routes. Okay? So if you haven't been coding along yet, let's start doing that now. Okay? So what we need to do is we need to import the browser router component from the React Router DOM library. Okay. So let's say you're jumping into a project, first time you haven't touched anything, right? We've already done this work for you, but a good rule of thumb is you can always go to Tools, go to Terminal, and you see here, right? So let's make sure we're in the right folder. So initially we started out in workspace. So let's cd into React Router demo. And we see here there's a package.json file, right? So we see that our package.json file already has React DOM and React Router DOM and React, right? So it's set up for us, but let's say it wasn't, right? So that's where you could go in here and say npm I React Router DOM if you don't already have it installed, okay? Again, we're not going to do that. It's already installed. We're fine. But that's something where before you start an application, make sure if you're trying to import a dependency, make sure it's installed first, right? Maybe it's not. But in our situation, we've already done that for you. So what we want to do is like what we had before is we want to import browser router from React Router DOM. So I like to organize my imports here. So on the top, I'm going to have all my React imports. And then here in a separate spacing, I'm going to have our component we're importing. Okay. So I'm going to go import, and inside of the curly braces, because remember, we are destructuring this component from our dependency. We're going to say browser router, and then I'll do from, and in quotation marks, I'll do React Router DOM. Okay. Add that semicolon here. So now, like we see here on the side, we want to wrap this app inside of the browser router component. So I will take this out. I will use my carets here. So browser router, right? But you have to make sure, since we're inserting a component inside of this component, we can't just do like browser router / like that, right? Because we actually have something we are putting inside of there. Okay, and then I'll put my app component inside of here. And that's all we have to do. Okay, so we've imported browser router, and then we want to have the router to be accessible in our app. So we have to make sure to wrap it like this. Okay, should be good to go. Good way to find out, you can go to the terminal, to npm run dev. I'm not trying to look at the application, but we're not seeing any errors, right? So that's good. Good way, we can see I could comment this out, right? Say, hey, I don't want to import it, but I want to use it here. Now I'll run npm run dev. And you might not see any errors already, but that's because we haven't actually run the application. So I say that because just because you see it rendering doesn't always mean you're not going to have issues, okay? That's why it's always good to test periodically. And by periodically, I do mean often, okay? So here it looks like our application is looking the same as the example, so we can move on. Now we want to add these React Router DOM components. Okay, so we have routes and route. So let's talk about that. What is the difference between the routes component and the route component? Don't focus so much on verbalizing the like exact, like perfect answer. But if you were just from what you understand so far, what is the difference between the routes component and the route component? Outside of a one-letter difference, of course. And Joseph, I do see your question. Veronica, if you wouldn't mind answering that one, so we can stay moving here. But let's see if anyone has an answer to the routes versus route distinction. I'll give you a few more seconds here. Looks like Joseph is typing again. Excuse me while I get air conditioner on. Routes is used for a collection of URLs, while route is for a single URL link. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So a route, the routes component groups together individual route components. So the route component is where we define the path and the component we want to go to when the path matches up with the URL, but we have to enclose it within that routes component. So again, you think about it, when you wrap a component in another component, at least when it comes to React Router DOM and React in general, you're going to have these baked in kind of like props and methods that we're able to pass in. You may not see it happening, but that's what's happening behind the scene. Okay. So Joseph, nailed it. Great job. So let's go step by step like we did last time. So we're going to import the routes and route components from React Router DOM. So I'm going to use this handy dandy clipboard. I'm going to do my organizing up here, and I'm going to throw this up here. Okay, so now by importing this, I can use routes and route. I also want to import the Bob's profile component. Okay, I'll import that here. So now I want to start defining some routes. So underneath the header, I'm going to add my routes component. Okay, make sure I close it out as well. And then I'm going to do a route with a path of / component. We want it to be the home page component. Okay. Now here, again, we're not trying to wrap anything inside of our route component. So we can do the / at the end. It's a void element. And for the sake of convenience, I'll duplicate that. And we're going to change this to Bob's profile. And I want this to go to, well, Bob's profile. Okay. So as we see here, the header component is outside of the routes component. Okay. And that means it's always going to be displayed irrespective of which route we're on, which if you think about it from a maintainability standpoint, it's great, right? We always want the header to be displayed. So we don't want it to be inside of our routes because that means it would be tied up to the route we're on. That's not what we're looking for, right? So the first two routes we have, again, / that's kind of like our catch-all. We're saying, hey, this is going to be our home page, our main page. After that, we're going to have a path of Bob's profile, which is going to go to Bob's profile. Now, what I'm going to do, I don't want you to do this. I just want to show you, I'm going to make this BB's profile, okay? Because I want you to understand what we type here, it doesn't have to necessarily match up to here, right? Or we could just say Bob's or Bob, okay? So again, the path we add doesn't have to match up with the name of the profile, which I know we see that here, but I just want to make that very clear, okay? So we also want to add a 404 page. So I think we talked about this before, but when you see a 404, that means not found. And that's going to be something you're going to see throughout your career is whether you're accessing an API or maybe someone types in or you type in the wrong address anywhere, right? You'll see a 404. Hey, this doesn't exist. Now, different websites will handle that differently. Maybe they just forward you back to the home page, or maybe they do actually have a 404 not found page. Okay. So we've already created that for us, or rather, we've already created that for you. So you don't have to create that component. What we're going to do, though, is like what we did with Bob's profile, is we're going to import that. Okay. We're going to import the not found component from this file. And then here is our asterisk. And this is when I say a catch-all, I probably should have said this, is the asterisk is going to say, hey, anything that doesn't match up to any of these components or paths, we want to direct them to the not found component, okay? So we can remove all of that, just add this little asterisk here, and then we're going to say not found. So it's a wildcard component. Okay, so I'm actually going to show you something really interesting here. So I'm going to throw this up, at least if this works the way that Angular does. So don't do what I did here. Okay. So I'm going to run the server. So if you click on terminal, you're already in the source directory. So we can do npm run dev. Okay. And then I'm going to open up the preview. Okay. It did not work, and that's what I was kind of wondering. React's always going to be a little different than Angular. Okay, so we're actually going to take this down here. We'll put that here. Okay, and then okay, let's run that again. We'll do the preview. Cool. So I've got a question for you though. Purposely did something wrong. I wanted to see if anyone caught it. What is wrong with my page here? Do we notice something? What seems off about this? If I go here to Bob, it's like Timo's typing. And obviously, y'all can hear me, but I still have moments of like, am I on mute? Like for some reason, I'm just with my main job. That tends to happen. You start talking, you realize you're on mute. So Timo says the characters reappear when you scroll down. Yes, and that is because when you're refactoring code, it's really important to understand what you're doing, right? So what I did, and this is right, is we have our route path of /, but I left in the homepage component. And that's where we have to remember, we have to tell React, our compiler, what we want to render, right? So what we've said is the homepage should be that main /. Remember how I was telling you where if you put the header inside of here, it would only display certain times. Well, we left the homepage component in here, right? So because of that, we're technically rendering the homepage component no matter the route we are on. Okay, so it's really important we pay attention to that. Okay, so if I was to hit refresh in here, we only have it the one time. Okay, so as I was talking about before, if I do / Bob, takes us to Bob. If I was to do Bob's profile, it's going to take me to 404, page not found, right? Because I put in a path that does not exist. What I was trying to see, and in some frameworks it is this way, but I didn't see it work, is depending on the order that you do your routes. So if I was to remove this, sometimes like in Angular, if you were to put your asterisk up top here, it would actually like be the main component and everything would get directed here because it kind of starts from top to bottom. Looks like React Router isn't that way, which is handy. But you have to be very specific in Angular to be like, nope, I want my catch-all to be at the bottom because, well, what if it's at the top, then everything's going to fall under that. So thankfully, that's not the case here in React. But still, it's always good to just kind of put your main path up top, and you can always put your wildcard at the bottom. Just as a sake of organization, you tend to see that anyway. Okay. So I'm going to change this back to Bob's profile, but we'll refresh, do Bob's profile, and we're good to go. Okay. How are we feeling about this? So we imported React Router DOM. We went to our app.jsx file, right? And we added the routes and the route components. And then we added in the path and the components to go where we want to go. Okay. So again, just make you understand how this works, I could change the wildcard to be Bob's profile, right? So then I could go in here and say Tina's profile, and it would still take me to Bob because I'm calling the shots here, right? I'm saying, hey, if it's an invalid or just anything that doesn't match what I have up here, this is the component I'm going to go to. So how are we feeling about that before we get moving on here? Because if we look at our features, we're about to start doing handling navigation. So we can take a 5-minute break if you'd like, or we could go ahead and go through handling navigation, and then we could take a 10-minute break. How are you all feeling about that? I'll let you, if you'd rather just keep moving forward and have full 10-minute break, we can do that. 10-minute break later. That's kind of what I was thinking. Okay, cool. So, but before we do that, how are we feeling about this? The concept makes sense so far, where we're wrapping our app in the browser router, and then we have our routes and route components. Are we feeling pretty good about that? Cool. I see several people typing. Does the route accept specific IDs like in HTML? Yeah, we're going to get there. Okay. But great question. So you'll see that. I mean, when you say specific IDs, you'll see how we're going to pass that in. Okay. So Tatiana says, need to catch up a lot to be able to say how I feel about that. But for now, this part seems okay. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So as long as we have, again, I feel like broken record, I'm always happy to repeat that. The goal here is never to be, you see this once, you understand it, right? So hopefully you all have that expectation of, oh, I don't fully get it. I must be doing something wrong, right? Like anything in life, you have to do it over and over and over again. I don't know how many people here in the chat are parents, but I can tell you this, like I have a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'm still having to learn things over and over and over again about how to be a parent, right? It's not something you figure out in the first week and boom, you're done. It's something that takes a lifetime. This is less, going to take less time, right? So, but it's still the same principle. It's the practicing, it's the seeing it numerous times that'll make sense. And that's why we encourage you to be working alongside the lesson, right? Because unless you're actually getting your fingers on the keyboard and working, it really just doesn't cement in the same way. But if you don't feel completely lost, that's what we're looking for, right? And we'll continue working on this step by step so that by the end of the lesson, you should have a better idea of what to do. Timo, so didn't get why the order of import is important. It's not. It's just an organizational thing. So it's based on, for me, if I'm having issues or I want to know what I've imported in a component, I like having like framework specific imports up top, and then I would have my like internal files in an import categorization under there. Not such a big deal here, but like if I could show you some of the code I'm working on, like I have at times 30 lines of imports, right? Because I need to, have it's a lot, right? So it's easy for me to have things organized. So whether I'm adding or maybe I'm removing, right? Maybe I no longer need an import or need a dependency. I know where to go in my file and remove it, right? Compared to there's no rhyme or reason with organization. Maybe that's how it works for you, and that's fine. You're organized that way. But when you're working with, 15 other developers, it's just easier to have organization. So that's it. But great question. All right. So now we're going to talk about the link component. And no, we're not talking about Zelda. So what we can do now is by importing a link component and utilizing it, we can access those routes that we've established. Okay. So again, link is a component provided by the React Router library. So we have to import React Router DOM, and we also have to set up those routes to utilize this. So what happens is this component inside of there is actually going to generate anchor tag like we've seen, right, in regular HTML, so just the A tag, but it's going to give us a little bit of extra features too. So if you really think about it, all of these custom components we're using, they're just HTML and JavaScript underneath the hood, right? That's all React is, but someone's done all the hard work for us so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? They've already reinvented that wheel for us. So this is an example of how we would use a link component. So let's say we have a nav bar, right? So we create a nav bar component. We've imported this link dependency, and we have a nav element. We have an unordered list element, unordered list element, and then we have our list item, right? And inside of there, we have a link component. But instead of href, it's a to property. And we're saying, hey, go to this route. Okay, so this link would say, hey, go to /. This one would say, go to /about. This one would take you to /contact. Okay, so again, we're importing that link component from React Router DOM. Inside of that navbar component, we're using link components instead of anchor tags to go to that route. And what's nice is it has this to prop, which is going to allow us to specify the path that we want to navigate when the link is clicked. So it can either be a string, right, representing the path name, or it can be an object with a path name and other properties. And that's why we want to use this, because not only does it allow us to pass in special properties, but your page isn't going to reload when you navigate from page to page. Okay, if you were to use a regular anchor tag, it would do that refresh, which is what we're not looking for, right? So with feature 2, we're going to import that link component. We're going to incorporate some links into our header component. And then we want to verify that everything's working as expected, right? No point of saying, hey, we're done if it's not working. Step 1. Super easy. Okay. Now you'll see in this previous example, it had import React from React, import link from. You don't have to import React in every single component. Back in the day, you actually used to. Now, as long as you've created your React component successfully, there should really only be one place that you're doing that, and it should just be in your index.jsx file. You notice here, we didn't import React again. You really only need to do it in one place. Okay? What we're going to do is we're going to import link from React Router DOM. So you'll notice here, if I was to do import curly braces link, it's not going to auto-populate, right? Because it doesn't really know where we want it to come from. That's just kind of a Codio thing. When you use VS Code and some of these other tools, when you do that, it's a little bit smarter about where we want it to go, okay? So it's really important that when we're typing, or you can just copy and paste, just make sure it matches up, okay? So that's it. That's the first step. Pretty straightforward there. We just want to make sure we can utilize this tool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to incorporate this link component. And what we want to do is we actually want to wrap both the logo image and the Bob's avatar with a link. Now, we don't want to go to the same place, right? But we want both of these elements to be links. So let's do this first one here, okay? So we're trying to wrap the Bob's Burger logo with a link component. So a couple different ways you could do this, right? Probably easiest way is just underneath the list item, just type link. And underneath the image, we'll do /link to close it out, okay? Now, for you, it might be easier just for organization. You take the image out, then you add it. It really doesn't matter. We just need to wrap this image with the link component. But again, we need to make sure that we're passing in the right path, okay? So you see here prior example, go back, they did path to /. So really depends on what you're trying to do, but since we're just doing a path, we should be able to get away with just saying to /. Okay. So here, this image, we'll do the same thing. We'll do link underneath the image. We'll do to, we're gonna do Bob's profile. But we need to make sure we put that / there. Okay. So what we're saying is when they click on link component, which doesn't render a new component, it's a wrapper, we're saying, hey, we should take it to this path here. So now, if I was to run npm run dev, we do our preview. Let's click on Bob's Burgers first, Bob, right? Because we want to make sure we're going to a new page. So if I was to click here, awesome. We're at Bob's profile. If I was to click here, it's going to take us back to the main page. Okay. And just to prove that the entire thing is not reloading, what I'm going to do is go to this app.jsx file. Okay. I'm going to actually import a use effect. I'm going to import use effect from React. Okay. And then I'm going to go use effect, an empty array. I'm going to do console.log the app has been rendered. All right. So I'm going to go in here, open up my tools. Okay. Now you're going to notice this gets logged twice. That is because we are in what's called a dev environment for React. Focus less on the multiple renders here because when I click on Bob's profile, it's not logging again. I click on here, it's not logging again. Okay. So we see because of that, this is actually only being logged once. When I navigate to different pages, it's not re-rendering, right? Now, if I hit refresh, we'll see the log again, okay? Again, you could go here and say React use effect rendering twice, dev mode. It's a very common thing. It says React strict mode renders components twice on the dev server. So you'd have to remove that strict mode from the index.js. I'm not going to do that. But my point is, if you were to actually deploy this into a production environment, you wouldn't see that happen. Why that's the case, I don't know. I've never looked into it. I'm not a React developer, but I just don't want it to be like, hey, so it looks like it's logging twice. It's because of the dev environment we're in. The point is, this is only happening once because we're not re-rendering the application on each navigation change. Okay? And that's it. We have added new paths to our application, and we've incorporated the link component into our application as well. Okay? We're at that 10-minute mark for a break. But before we do that, how about that? Like, so we went from incorporating the routes, but now we're adding the links. We feel like that's pretty easy to understand. Like it's really an anchor tag, right? Like we've had before, but by using the link component, we're not re-rendering the application on route change. So how are we feeling about that before we go to break? Any questions we can go over? Yeah, again, this is your time, so I want to make sure any questions you can just private message me. If you don't feel comfortable asking, you can ask Veronica. We can address that. because the next section is where we're going to start actually passing in props and data into our routes and links. Okay, Joseph's giving a thumbs up. Timo says, cool. Cool, cool, cool. All right. Usually I look for about 3 positive responses before we move on. So it is currently, we'll just say 10 after. So let's come back at 20 after. And then from here, like I said, we're going to be looking at dynamic routing. Okay. And then if we have time after that, we'll go over stack blitz a little bit too. Okay. So that you have a little bit more familiarity with some outside tools. Okay. So let's come back at 20 after. Wow. Sorry, welcome back, everyone. I want to do an icebreaker. I haven't done one of these yet. So, if you had to live in the universe of a book franchise, let's not even do movies. What would it be? Like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Dune? Oh God, that'd be sadistic. Yeah, I'm curious to hear what you all would choose. Sherlock Holmes. Okay. Yeah, that's I would imagine the actual Sherlock Holmes would be pretty interesting. I didn't mind the Robert Downey Jr. movies, but obviously it's very Hollywood-esque, not quite what we got in the books. Fire and Blood. Oh, talking about sadistic. Yeah, you're on your own there, I think. I would not join you. I think I would do Lord of the Rings like post the ring getting destroyed. I wouldn't really want any of the time before that. You'd probably be drunk in a tavern. Hey, Omar, I don't drink anymore, but I'll drink to that. Lord of the Rings. Yep. Yep. Conan. Like, I'm assuming you mean Conan the Barbarian, right? Not Conan O'Brien.
What
The
about the
Monkey
Detective
King.
Conan?
Oh, that one too. Yeah. Did this get turned off? Nope, it's still off. The Monkey King. Why does that sound familiar? Isn't that like what? I feel like that was part of what Dragon Ball was based off of. Okay. Yep. Okay. Conan the Barbarian. Okay. Yep. From the Journey to the West. Yep. 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 Okay. Awesome. I love seeing those responses. That's great. Okay, so we are getting into dynamic routings. Oops, let me share my screen again here. So, dynamic routes. What this means is we can have routes that have parameters, right? So if you think about like a function in JavaScript, the parameter is what we pass into the parentheses, right? So let's think if we had a blog application. So we talked about Omar's fabulous website or whatever we had called it in the blog, right? And we wanted to have a route for each individual blog post. Well, we don't want to have to make a page for every single post. That's crazy. That's it, it's as soon as you have 20 blog posts, your routes are going to get out of control, right? So instead of hard coding routes for each post, we can use dynamic routes. So what we see here is we have a route of blog, which would be our list of blogs. But then we also have blog /:colon ID. And what that means is that is the dynamic parameter that can match that segment. So it could be like first post, second post, anything. Here's how you can, win $1 million, right? I don't know. Like whatever that ID is, we can put in there. Or, you could have a website like this one here, rough type, a guy named Nicholas Carr. And each post is / am I still on throttle? Or is it just really slow? Yeah, it's just really slow. So we have here oh wait, he's ending his blog. Oh, whoops. Okay. So the parameter would be 9290, right? So if I did 9289, well, I guess that's not a parameter. Maybe he deleted a post. So then we could go here, large language 9271. I don't know what his IDs are, right? But that would be the point is you could add in, 9290 takes me back to this post. I guarantee he does not have these routes hard coded. I guarantee it. So again, huge benefit to that. So we're going to introduce a new hook, right? So use effect, use state, those are hooks. And this use params is going to allow us to to access those parameters from that URL and use that within our code. So when we have a route like ID or anything prefixed with that colon, we can use params to take the value of that parameter. So let's say we have this component called blog post. Okay. So we'll import use params. Here, we're going to destructure our use params hook to get this ID parameter. So now we could have an H1 that says blog post and we have ID. So we're using the curly braces to interpret something to use in JSX. So we could say whatever ID and it would render here as a string, which is incredibly neat. That's not how we're necessarily going to use it, right? To render text. We're actually going to use this for API calls and content rendering. So feature 3, we have a handful more steps than we had before, right? So first, we want to implement that dynamic routing in our app.jsx file. Then we're going to use a link component from the React router on our home page. In the character profile, we're going to use that use params hook to get parameters from the URL. We're going to use state to manage the state of our application. We're going to use all hopscotch again to verify the endpoints. We're going to use effect to make asynchronous data fetch requests. And then we're going to use some rendering to track whether that data is being fetched or not. And then lastly, we're going to use the API data to dynamically generate character profiles. Any thoughts before we actually start getting our hands dirty here? And if not, that's fine. But I just figured we'd take a stop here, look at the steps, and see if we have any thoughts. Okay, let's go. So let's add some dynamic routing to our app file. So in our app.jsx file, we want to import that character profile component. Okay. So here we can do import character profile from, that's a lot, right? So let's just copy it. Easy way to make sure we don't have any typos. So now what we want to do is add a new route. Okay, I would recommend typing this one out. So we're going to add a new route component. Okay. The path is going to be /character /:ID. So remember, this colon is signifying that we want to have a parameter, and then we just add a string here to indicate what that parameter should be. So we want it to be an ID. Okay. And then the component we want to render will be character profile. Okay. So right now, it seems pretty straightforward. We haven't really done a whole lot yet, right? But again, path /character /:ID. And then we want the component we're going to render is going to be a character profile. We haven't really established yet how we're going to pass in the data yet, right? But that's not the concern at this point. So we're just trying to say whenever a route hits character / and an ID, we should be rendering the character profile component. So now let's go ahead and add a link so that we can actually go to this profile. Okay. So as before, we need to import the link component. So I'm going to do that here. So we'll do import link from React router DOM. Okay. So now I'm going to make this a little bigger. Inside of this map method that we have down here, we're going to wrap our div with a class of character item with a link component. Okay, so we can see this here in the example. Okay, so we have link key equals character.id, 2, and this is where we do want to have it in curly braces, right? Because we're going to be rendering this variable, and we want to be able to have it be a string for the path we're going to. Okay. So again, we see this character item div here, but I mean, you could leave the key here. That's kind of up to you, but we do need to wrap this div inside of a link. Okay. We'll type link. Oops. Make sure we're wrapping it around the right element. So we see a div here, the div closes here. So we'll do link. And if we beautify our lint, or I guess, format our file, we should see that everything lines up accordingly if we did that correctly. Awesome. So link to link, right? So now we want to add our path. Okay. So you say 2 equals, and we'll do our curly braces. And since we're going to be doing a string template literal, right, we want to put the backticks here, /character, $, curly braces, character.id. Okay. So this 2 prop of the link component, we're going to be setting it to character / whatever that character ID is. So if a character ID was 25, it'd be character / 25. Okay. That here, that 1, 2, 3 ABC example, or if it's 25, that would be that ID that we're getting from the API, if you remember how that works. And we're going to render, we're going to run the application. It's not going to necessarily work quite yet, but let's just see how it's working so far. Okay. And just to be mindful, in Codio, you can't see the dynamic URL changes. So we want to open it up in a new browser. Okay. So let's run npm run dev. Okay. We can click here to preview the page, but let's open it up in a new browser. So let's reiterate how this API call is working. Okay. Oh, I see why it wants us to do that. Okay, we'll go back to that. So I'm going to hit refresh. And what I want to do is I'm going to select this button here that says fetch /XHR. Okay. And what this is doing is it's showing us all of the API calls that are being made. So again, in a dev environment, we see it happening twice, but we can see here all the different IDs we're getting, right? We have 110, 167, 227, 275, 280, 467. Looks like the IDs are actually based off of alphabetical order, which not a horrible thing, right? But what if they add a new character and it's in the middle of Dalton and Gene? How would you handle that ID, right? So I'm not in charge of Bosberger's API, but that's just something I was thinking about. But let's fix this, right? I was saying this key here. So we actually want to add this key up here because we want the key based on the parent component that's being rendered with that map. Okay, so I was kind of wondering why that was the case. I hit refresh here. We don't see that key error anymore, right? Because the key is being added to each link component. So we've satisfied that. But again, if we go to our elements here and we get into the DOM, we'll see how it's working. And we'll see that everything is being rendered like we want. So, right, so we see a link. Technically, it's still a anchor tag, right? And we see it's going to character / 110. Here we see an anchor tag going to 167. Here it's going to 227. So if I was to click on this, it's just taking us to this route here. But do you see right here? It's going to 110. If I go back and click on Gene, it's going to 167. Right? So we see that that dynamic ID or that parameter that we add is actually working, right? But we haven't done anything with the main component yet. It's still just this generic boilerplate character profile page. But the link itself is doing exactly what we want it to do. We're saying, hey, go to character / character.id, right? And that route is being generated because in our app.jsx file, we're saying, well, there's going to be a route called character / ID, right? So if I was to change this to profile, would it work? Let's find out. It still works, right? Because this part here is less important than the fact that eventually we will destructure what this should be. But honestly, and I will say from a maintainability standpoint, if you know you're going to be navigating based on an ID, just call this ID. It's going to be a lot easier to keep track of if you don't have different parameter names on each page. Okay. So even though on the home page, we're going to character.id, I could have this app.jsx be profile ID or something like that. But down the road, as you continue working on this, it's going to get really confusing. So just, again, I'm just helping you now. Just name it the same thing. It'll make more sense as you're trying to work on it, and you're not going to get confused based on the parameter name. Okay? So I could even go in here and just say everything should go to, let's just say 50, right? You go in here and it's going to go to 50. That goes to 50. That goes to 50, right? You can put in here whatever you want based on your project, right? So with project 9, you'll want to determine how to route your user. But again, what we're saying is we want to go to the character route and we want to pass in a specific value, which in this instance is a character ID. Okay? Any questions about what we've done here? Link component, we've given a specific key, and we're saying, hey, we want to go to this dynamic route, which should be character / character.id. Okay? We'll stop for a second. What questions do we have? And if we don't have any questions, that's fine. Just let me know before we move on. I don't want to move on too quickly here, okay? Pretty clear. Awesome. Made the mistake of doing some vocal recording before this. I had the week off from my main job, so my throat's a little scratchier than normal. So sorry about that. Okay. Now let's add use params in the character profile. Okay. So this is where, like I said, the naming of parameters is going to be really important. So I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit. Okay. Just so bear with me here. I'm going to go back and forth. So in our character profile, we want to import use params from React Router DOM. All right. So if we don't import it, we can't use it. Use params from React Router DOM. Okay. So now in our component, we want to use params, right? So we'll say const, we're going to destructure this, the ID equals use params, okay? We have to make sure we have the parentheses here because we need to actually call this method, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do console.log ID, okay? And I'll show you why. I'm going to go back here. Actually, you know what? I can probably stay on that page. Let's just run a new terminal, cd into React Router demo, npm run dev. Okay. So let's refresh this page here. I'm going to go to Jimmy Pesto, and we see here 227, 227, right? Because what I did is I want to take the ID and console log that ID. Okay. So what happens if I do profile ID? I go in here. Ooh, it's undefined. And why is that? Can we think of why that might be undefined? I mean, really, I'm just saying I want the ID, right? Like, why could I not get the params of ID from use params? I mean, it should know what I want, right? Can we think of why that might not work? So you're saying, Sarah, the ID should match. I think if I had to guess, what you're saying is it's the parameters should match, right? So in a route, you could technically have multiple parameters. So I could go in here and say ID / and then say verify. Okay. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. We're just making a parameter here. Okay. So then let's go to our character profile, or I guess our it would be our homepage component. And then here, I'm going to do / and say true. Okay. So inside of my character profile, I'm going to change this back to ID. I'm going to say verified. Okay. So now I'm going to console log ID and verified. If I hit refresh, I see 167 and true. Okay. The reason for that is when we set up our routes, these parameters we're creating here, like I was saying earlier, we have to be very specific in how we want to name these. Now, in the actual like link, it doesn't have to match up, right? Maybe the API gives us a property called UUID. So we talked about UIDs, right? A unique user identification. We can't control what the API gives us. What we can control is how we are creating our parameters. So here I'm saying each route should have two parameters, ID and verified. So that's why inside of my character profile, I'm destructuring what the use params is giving me. And I'm saying, hey, I want the ID out of here and I want verified. Or I could say, hey, I just want ID, right? I don't care about verified at all. So just show me what the ID is. 167. So that's why I was saying earlier, we have to be very careful on how we are going back and forth with our parameters here. Okay, so just be as specific as you need to be and be consistent, right? I can't just decide to rename this parameter later. Okay. So all that to say, let's go back here. Oh, see, and that's exactly, I go back into my route in the home page and I'm passing in a new parameter, but that parameter doesn't exist, right? So I can't just pass whatever I want in there. Okay, so we're back to where we were. Okay, so in our character profile, we have const ID because we're getting that from the param. We're using use params hook. It says, hey, there's an ID attribute. Cool, we can use it. Okay. So we know it's working because, well, what could I do? I could go in here. I can make an H1. Okay. Let's do an H1. Oops. And I could do ID 1227. Now, let's say you didn't want it to be called ID, right? That's fine. You could just say const profile ID equals ID. You know, that's fine. You can do whatever you want with it once you get the data, right? But you just cannot destructure a parameter from the use params unless it's the actual attribute name. Okay. So next page. I'll get rid of this. We don't actually need that. So now we want to handle the state management. Okay. So we want to make that API call and we want the application to manage that data that we're getting. We don't want to have to keep making these calls over and over and over again. And we also just want to get specific data as well. So in our character profile component, we want to import these two new, I'd say new, but new dependencies. Okay. We want use state and use effect. We've used these before, no pun intended. So now we can use these hooks in our component. So inside of our component, again, we don't want to set it outside. We need to make sure it's inside of our component here. We're going to do const character info, comma, set character info, right? And we'll do a use state of null. Oftentimes you'll do null because you don't want it to be anything, but maybe you don't want to specifically say it's going to be a object with these properties, right? You can just say null. That's totally fine. If you were to use a Boolean or string value, though, I wouldn't suggest null, right? If it's an object or an array, sure. If it's a Boolean or a string or a number, you should always set the default value there. So here we do const is loading, set is loading, I'm going to use state and true. So question, why are we setting the use state to true? Wouldn't we want false? Like, isn't false a default value? Think back to our exercise last week. Why would we set it to true in the beginning? I know we haven't set that code up yet, but just think back to that example. Why might we want to set it to true at first? Can you make up your mind? You're just going up and down. See, Joseph's typing here. It says, because we want it to re-render every time the page loads. I think I know where you're coming from here. So again, when we do use state, we want to set a default value, right? So when we think through how our application is working prior, but also now, right? Hopefully you're thinking ahead. We want the page to be loading until we have everything we want, and then we can render our content, right? And then it's no longer loading. So the default value would be, is loading would be true, right? So you put everything behind the loading component, the API call finishes, and then you display the content and it's no longer loading. So you may have an application though, where you think about, you go to a page and I'm sure you all have seen this before. if you know anything about Childish Gambino, so like band name generator, right? I don't think this is the original one, but you might have something like this, right? Where it's not necessarily loading in the beginning, but if I was to generate band names, imagine there was a loading screen at that point, right? So is loading would be false at first. You click on generate band names, it loads, and then it's no longer loading again. So it depends on the application. So that's where you have to think through, what do I want this default value to be? In this instance, it would be that is loading would be true because we want to display the loading component like we did last week. Once the API call is finished, then it's no longer loading. Okay. So we've created this use state value, and then we're going to create a little loading message, right? Again, you could create a separate component for this. It's totally up to you. It depends on what you're working on. I would always opt for just a loading component, so then I could reuse it multiple times, right? So let's look at this example here. So pretty similar to what we've already seen. They just had the ID up top. Really doesn't matter. And then inside of here, right? So the loading component, it looks like they actually didn't even add it in the example. So that's my fault for not checking on that. So what we could do is this character profile. I'm trying to think of easiest way. Let's just do this. Let's go to is loading, right? And then we'll do our parentheses here, and we'll do a p tag. We'll say loading, right? But we can't just do is loading. We also have to say, well, what happens when it's not loading, right? Do parentheses. Okay. So let's make sure that works. We'll open the terminal. Oops, need to move into our folder here. Okay. Let's go back to our main page. Let's see. Import. Look at these errors a little better. So import can only be used in import meta. Interesting. I don't think you would care about this. Oh, there's a plus sign there. That was weird. Yep, my bad. Okay. Then we'll hit refresh. Okay, so now we get the actual error. So unexpected token, expected comma. Okay. Because I was missing that. That goes there. Okay. What is my linter doing to me? Let's do this. Let's remove this. We're going to take all this out. Take the main. I'm missing something. Return. I don't think that would do it either. Oh, yep, there we go. So we had is loading and we'd return this. So I guess there's a couple different ways. We've talked about ternary operators too, right? So we could do that. Let me pull this code over to the side. We'll see here. Sometimes it's hard for me to type on a small window like this. here. Pull up the chat. See if anyone. I'm curious if anyone else is trying to get this solved on your end. I'm typing here. Yeah, I normally don't look at the solutions down here, so I'll make sure we get that resubmitted. Okay, so what we could do, let's remove this. So is loading, and then let's do make sure that works. And then we'll just do a null if it's not. Okay, so we know it's still working. So then we'll set this here, re-render. Okay, so now we need to make sure that once this API call is finished, which we haven't quite got there yet, right? We want to make sure that we're setting is loading to false. So let's go ahead and go to the API endpoint. So now, and just again to reiterate what we did here, is we did a turn error operator where we're evaluating based on is loading. Okay. So if I was to set the default value here to be false, and I would need to make sure to run the terminal again because it did close. CD into React router demo, and run dev. Okay. So again, to reiterate, we did a ternary operator based on is loading. So if is loading is true, we would return this content. If is loading is false, we would return this content here. Okay, so the original content we had. So I'll set that back to true. And we should just see loading. Perfect. Okay. So before we do the API call, let's verify that it even works, right? Last thing we want to do is get really far into this API, making, setting everything up, and then we don't have something correct, okay? So let's just test an endpoint that's provided here. So Bob's Burgers /api.herokuapp.com/characters/51. Okay, so we'll copy this and let's go into hopscotch.io like we had before. Okay. So it actually still has that API endpoint we had used prior. Let's replace this with the Bob's Burgers. Make sure it's a get, right? We don't want to post, we want to get. We'll hit send, and we'll see that ID 51 that we passed in here should give us Bob Belcher Jr. or Robert Bob Belcher Jr. Okay, so we see a bunch of stuff about him, who his relatives are. We see down here, wiki URL, image, etc. So we know that the API endpoint works, which is awesome. Okay, but we need to look at the endpoint, right? See what we're getting back. So we don't want to just start throwing things into our code without knowing what we're working on. So again, we see there's relatives, there's a name. We can go down here, the image, gender, age, etc. Okay. So now we know how the data is structured, which means we can start using this data to fill out the profile. And we can also use the ID from that use params hook to start getting information about that character. Because as we saw prior, before the server started, it was just like a John Doe, right? So gender male, voiced by H. John Benjamin. So none of this is dynamic, right? This isn't a good character profile. This is hard-coded. And what if a character, their voice actor changes, right? So if you wanted to make a page about Bob's Burgers, you wouldn't want to hard code everything in. If you're using this API, we would make the API request and generate it. And based on that API response, it could update throughout the years, right? But your code wouldn't necessarily have to change. So in our application, we want to add that use state hook, okay? And I'm also seeing why the code wasn't working the way it was because we haven't quite got there yet. So let's add this use effect, and I'm going to type this out. We'll do use effect. We'll have the anonymous arrow function here, and we want to add the array. I'm not going to add anything in there yet, right? I see what I'm supposed to add here, but we're going line by line. So we want to have the actual API call inside of our use effect. So we'll create a function here called fetch character data, which, I'm going to write it like how I would normally do. Obviously, follow the example if you'd like, but let's just do a function called fetch character data. And if we do it this way, we would say async function. Okay. We'll do our parentheses, curly braces. Let's do our try catch. Okay, so we'll do try catch. We want the error, which is automatically given to us, right? We don't have to create a variable called error. It just knows that, well, if there is an error and it's caught, well, this is that argument that's given to us innately in this try catch. We'll do const response, and I am going to copy and paste this. Okay. So we say const response equals await fetch. So we want this endpoint, right? And we want to pass in the ID that we're getting from our use params. Okay. So after that, once we get that response, we're going to create a new variable called const data, and we have to await that response, and it's a conversion into a JSON object. So remember, we'll get this response, which is great, but it's not quite how we need it. So we have to now convert that response into a JSON object. So now what we can do is set character info to that data we just received, right? So we get that data from the endpoint and we want to update our state so it can manage it for us. So we're going to set that character info to the converted API response. And then we also want to do set is loading to false, right? Because now we know we have that data, so we can get rid of that loading page. And just so we can visualize it better, I'll do a set timeout, and we'll do a timeout of 1 second. Actually, we'll do 1.5 seconds. Okay. So inside of that catch, we'll do console.error, error fetching character data error. Okay. But just because we've created this function doesn't mean it's going to get called automatically, right? So what we want to do here now is invoke that function of fetch character data. And inside of our dependencies array, we want to do the ID, right? Because we want this to be called if the ID is updated. Now, you might think, well, of course, right? It's a use effect. It should just be called whenever the component renders. But let's say you were navigating from one character profile to the next one, right? Well, it's still the same component. So you'd want to make sure it's only being called when that ID, either when the component is mounted initially or when that ID property is updated. Okay. So looking here, we're utilizing this endpoint that we've already established, right? We looked at the previous page and we verified it in Hopscotch. But that ID here is coming from our use params. So if you went to character/27, this API call should be made with an ID of 27. And in here, again, we're utilizing the ID as a dependency. So whenever the ID or the URL changes, that use effect is going to be executed. Okay. That ensures that the data displayed on our page stays up to date with that character's unique ID specified in the URL. Okay? What questions do we have at this point before we move on? Something I want to do really quick while we have a minute, I'm going to say const page message and then do set page message. We do use state of empty string. The reason I'm doing that is, let's say I'm going to have the initial message actually be loading. And then here, if we have an error, I could do set page message to be there was an error fetching character data. The reason I want to suggest this is, as you're thinking about error handling, this is a way you could do that in a single component so you don't have to make multiple components. And then we could go here, right? Because I don't even technically have to update it, because if it's set loading is false, then if there's an error, the loading wouldn't go away, right? So I just want to kind of show this really quick. I'll make an error in the API. So then if I was to run this, oops, again, React router demo, npm dev. If I did this right, go here to the main page. Okay. So there was that error here, but it doesn't look like the try catch happened the way I wanted. So let's comment this out really quick. That's a bummer. I was really hoping that would work. We fetch that data. Again, that's what I get for going outside of the bounds here. So I'll kind of circle back around to that if we have time. But the reason I bring that up, and again, just kind of throwing that on the fly here, is if there is an error fetching API data, you want to have something to actually visualize that to the user, right? So the last thing you want to do is leave something in there that would cause an issue for the user and not give them something to work with, right? So again, like I had made that typo there, but if I was to spend more time actually incorporating that, we could set it up where it would say, hey, there was an error, try again, right? So you could technically do that in here. I can get back to that later. I just want to at least have you all thinking about that, where with your project, you can't control, you're going to be working with an API. You can't control how the API is going to react when Veronica's grading it. So if you have some good error handling there, you could potentially save yourself a headache of her going in and being like, oh, hey, the API is down, but your project is handling that in a way where she knows that rather than there actually being an error in the code. Okay? So just, again, something to think about. So let's move to the next page here where we're going to have that conditional rendering. So it looks like the way that the example has it, where instead of a ternary operator, they're just doing an if else. Okay. So really depends how you want to do that. It doesn't matter too much. You can do the ternary, you can do the if else. The way Codio is doing this, it doesn't really seem to like the ternary in regards to the formatting. So we could just do it this way, right? So I'll go here from line 28 down to line 56. Make sure I don't have any errors there. I will hit tools, terminal, cd to React router demo. Run this again. It says loading, and then we get what we want, right? So looks like they added a class name of loading too, which makes it a little bit less clunky than it was before. But the point is, whether you use the ternary operator or not, or use an if else, it really doesn't matter. As long as your code is working the way that it should be. Okay. So what we see here is the use effect hook is called to fetch the character data from that API. So while it's loading, we display loading, right? Once that loading is completed, which again, I added that set timeout just to make sure we could actually see that happen. And then once the 1.5 second completes after this portion of the code, then we can go ahead and display the content. As we can see here, we see the API called 167. I changed to 27, right? So we see that the ID from that route is being passed in correctly to this endpoint in our code. Okay. So we see here we have 2 pages left. So now we want to replace that mock data. Okay. So after setting up that character profile with that use state and use effect, we want to go ahead and replace everything in here so that we can actually dynamically render our profile. So what we want to replace, as you can see here, is the name, gender, the voice actor, and occupation, and we also want to replace the image. Okay. So all of this is laid out. So what I would like to see us do is for the next 5 minutes. So it's currently 10 after. So let's come back at 16 after, but I want you all to take a crack at this. So we have what it should be here for like character image, what that URL should be. So let's go ahead and take what's happening here and replace our content so that when we come back, we should be able to replace whatever ID in the URL, and it should be that character for that ID. Okay, so let's come back at 16 after, and let's see if we're able to make that work. Okay. All right, welcome back, everyone. If you could throw in the chat that you're back, or if you're able to complete and get that successfully rendered, maybe you didn't try yet, which is fine. Just letting me know that you're back, and we'll look at what it should look like when it's working. All right, Joseph's back. Let's see if anyone else. So Dragos is here. Timo. Let's see. Omar isn't back, or his camera's not on yet. Let's see. Oh, there's Omar. Awesome. Okay, cool. So let me share my screen here. So if you did everything successfully, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the next page. Okay. And our terminal will run npm run dev. And on our main page here, we should see everything like it was before. Tatiana's back. Awesome. And if we click on Tina, we should see some data about Tina. Female, voiced by Dan Mintz, and her occupation is a grill cook, server, busser at Bob's Burgers. I was to go back again and click on Dalton Crespin. We see that he's a blogger, voiced by John Early. Okay, so we were able to do this by going into the character profile component. And in our image attribute, we passed in character info.image. If you remember, we fetch our data, we set the character info state right up here. And now, well, we don't have to map over anything, right? It's not like what was in the other page or the other component. We're just taking that prop of character info and we're accessing the image property. And how do we know it's image? Well, we look at our API response and we see a property of image. We see a property of age, occupation. So I could go in here, technically, I'm not saying I want to do, like you should do that, but I could do character info.age for gender, right? And now, well, that's weird, right? That didn't work. Okay. And that's because, go into Dalton Crespin, we have to see, well, there's a whole lot. Maybe we don't have an age for that character, right? So if I go here and I look at his ID of 110, and this is why it's important to look at your responses. Well, he actually doesn't have an age property. Not all characters are going to have that property, right? So instead, why don't I change this to air? Okay. So again, there's all these different things we could get for each character, right? And that's why it's also important to understand if there's not a property for each of these components or each of the characters, maybe not a good thing to put on there. So we have character info.name, character info.image being passed in as the source attribute, character info.voiced by, and character info.occupation. So is there anyone where when you tried doing this, you were not able to make this work? I want to make sure we cover that before we get here to the last recap page. So is anyone unable to successfully do that? Looks like I've got a few people typing here. Manage after breaking it completely. Love it. Yep. Been there, done that. You've seen me do it on camera, so it's a very normal thing. Again, I feel like that's part of one of the best ways to learn how to code is to break things. So as a recap, let's look at this last page here to understand what we went through today. There's a lot. So we learned about React Router. We take React Router, we import it into our application. We take that browser router and we wrap our component with browser router to say, hey, I want everything in my application to have access to React Router. Okay. Inside of our app component, we now have routes, which is a component, and different route components. So inside of our routes component, we now have multiple route components that give us we can set what the path should be and what component we should render. Okay. And then throughout our application, we used link components, which are like anchor tags, or anchor elements that we've had prior. But if we can remember, class, what is the difference between a regular A tag, right, anchor tag, and the link component? What is the major difference between the two of these? So even though a link component will render an A tag, there is a substantial difference between the two, and why, if you are using React Router, you should use the link component. Do we remember what that major difference is? Give it a few more seconds, see if anyone remembers. So if we use the link component, oh, wait, Sarah's typing. Let's see. Let's see what we come up with. Without causing a full page reload. Beautiful. Yep, that's absolutely correct. Now, there may be a time where you want to take a user to a different website in general, right? You can still use the link, but at that point, maybe you just want to use the A element, right? And that's fine. But if you're navigating internally within your React application, always use the link component. So once we've established that, then we have some dynamic routing, right? So we want to be able to have a single page or a single component or a view, but we want dynamic content inside of that component. What we can do is we can pass that parameter, right, in the URL. We take that parameter and then we use params inside of that component, and we can do whatever we want with it, right? Maybe we have an internal database that we can access through an API. We get that ID or a username. blog posts, whatever, and we can render that content dynamically, right? And we also want to have that not found page. From time to time, maybe a user inputs something incorrectly, maybe an API call fails and then it doesn't load the page, whatever the case is, we just want to make sure we have something to handle those errors, right? So key takeaways with all of this: React Router is incredibly powerful, easy to use, that allows you to have dynamic and responsive web applications. If you're going to use React Router, it's vital to use routes and link components to be able to navigate throughout our application without a full page reload. And then that dynamic routing allows us to use params, so we can take that route, take the parameters out of there, and dynamically generate content for our components, so we don't have to hard code each route. Okay? So we've got 5 minutes left. Any questions before we part ways? I was going to do a little bit of Stack Over Blitz if we had time, but obviously I'd rather make sure we get through our entire lesson here, right? Because you could look up Stack Over Blitz on YouTube, wherever else, right? So let's make sure. Any doubts, questions, concerns? We've got 5 minutes. Please, anything I can clarify before we part ways and circle back up tomorrow for our project 8 overview and then project 9. Okay, Joseph's typing here. So when creating nav web pages for real world applications, we have to use React Router and not HTML way. So again, it depends on the application you're using, right? So in our instance, since it's a React application, it would make sense to use React Router, right? If for some reason you wanted the entire page to reload, yeah, you could do that. But as you start building more complicated applications, that's not ideal. So think about it this way. I'll kind of break down an example of my day-to-day application, right? So a user would enter our application, they have an ID. We have to verify, well, is this user allowed to even come into the application? So we make an API request, get that data. Okay, so now they're verified. What page should they go to, right? Maybe they were on a page prior, we want to bring them back to that page. After literally a lot of API calls, we finally get them to a point where, okay, they're ready to enter the application. So now I want their name, I want their email, I want all these different things, right? If I was to use basic HTML to navigate them from page to page, we'd go to the next page. We'd have to go over all those API calls again, right? The amount of API requests we'd have to make for a 20-page flow for this user and have to get that information time and time and time and time again. It's not only a bad user experience, but on our end, it'd actually be really expensive because we have to keep making these API calls. And even though they're internal, we still have to pay Microsoft to use their servers and to use their requests, right? It gets very annoying and complicated. Whereas if you have this routing in place, you do all of these things when the component initially renders, and then we can use our state management to say, hey, this is what the user's name should be, all these different things, right? So then they go from page to page to page. But in our main application, all of this state is already saved. So I don't have to keep making those API calls again, right? I have access to all of that. So if I go to another page where I need to know, hey, has this user done X, Y, or Z? Well, I already have that state saved. I know that. I don't have to make a new API call. And I'm not concerned about the page refreshing unnecessarily. Does that make sense? So when you have that internal routing, it minimizes the amount of API requests you may have to make, state management getting reset, the page having to, it's a multitude of reasons why not having to re-render things unnecessarily just makes an overall better user experience. So you could use just your basic boilerplate HTML, sure, but that's not advisable, especially the more complicated and involved your applications become. So that's why we're encouraging you to use this, because if you're going to use React, you want to build a single page application. And if your single page application has multiple pages, the best user experience and the best state management and data management experience for you will be to use React Router. Okay. So hopefully that helps answer your question. If not, I'm happy to chat asynchronously as well. So, okay. And seems to have helped. Awesome. Well, I don't have anything else. Tama, if you have anything, or Veronica, if you have anything you'd like to share, just a reminder, we are going to be reviewing Project 8, right? So I'm going to be spending about an hour or so going over Project 8. So it's important to make sure you have that turned in. I don't know the exact time if you can provide that, but obviously want to make sure you've got